I'm excited to be here. This is a unique opportunity for me to talk with real experts about a topic that's interested me for a while now. But let me tell you about myself. So I'm a professor of economics, which is a little strange to be giving a talk about pest resistance, an entomology, agricultural topic. I got into this topic kind of in an indirect way, so I think it's an interesting story. A few years ago, I decided to write a general interest book about game theory. And I thought, well, the most effective, interesting way to write such a book would be to look for unsolved strategic challenges out in the world, okay? And bonus points if all the experts say it's impossible to solve it, all right? And then use the methods of game theory, what I call the game theory approach in the book, to actually identify novel solutions. When I had a promising potential solution, I would then email the world's leading experts, and surprisingly got a good hit rate that a bunch of them wrote back, and invariably they would say, David, you're all wrong. You don't understand the first thing about X, Y, and Z, okay? But then we would have a conversation, and the suggested improvements, it would get to a point where I had something even they felt, you know what, that actually makes sense, and that's what gets in the book. This topic is still at that early stage. My study of control-resistant pests, I haven't been studying this for years. I have a certain level of knowledge. I'm throwing stuff on the wall with you, and I'm expecting there to be problems with it. So if you hear me say something that makes no sense, call me out on it. I want that. That's part of the reason I'm here. Okay, and hopefully we can have an ongoing conversation after the talk, and we can improve some of the ideas, and you can tell me what works or what could work. Okay? And in particular, I've spent quite a while actually engaging with experts when it comes to antibiotic resistance and developing approaches and strategies not just to limit the spread of resistant disease, but actually to reverse resistance and restore susceptibility so the drugs that haven't worked can work once again. Okay, so that's something I have explored, and I'm going to be using insights I've gained from that and applying it to the problem of control-resistant pests. Okay, so that's sort of the general framework. The overall plan for the talk, first I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what games are and why games and game theory is relevant to crop management. Then talk about the question of, is resistance inevitable? Most people have a view that it is inevitable, it's just a matter of time. I'm going to push back against that view. It is not inevitable. Okay? And I'm going then to lay out the game theory of pest control and apply it to specific applications. And in particular, the two applications associated with Western corn rootworm I'm going to discuss are rotation resistance, so the pest that lays its eggs in the soybeans, and then the Bt toxin resistance. Okay, so those are the two applications for Western corn. I'm also going to talk about antibiotics as well to make analogies. Okay, so first of all, what is a game? Okay, we use the word game. We're talking, you naturally think, maybe monopoly, or maybe you have a negative connotation, like a manipulation of someone, taking advantage, being selfish. That's what playing games means in vernacular English, right? That's not at all what I'm talking about. Okay? The most important games you play are with the people you care about and you want what's good for them. Okay? Those are the most important games, and game theory can help you in those relationships as well. So here's one of the best best quotes I've found to talk about what is a game. So the Scottish poet John Donne, 1624, wrote, you may have heard this phrase, no man is an island, okay, entire of itself. We're all connected to others, and every one of those connections is a game. Okay? Technically speaking, a game's any situation with multiple decision makers, okay, where one player's decision, so my decision can impact you, or your decision can impact me. And of course, there's a whole web of games. So it's not really helpful to think about games in isolation. They're part of what's known as a strategic ecosystem. So in the world of pest management, for example, we can think of games, for instance, that pests play amongst themselves. Okay, so these are obviously first-order importance. If there's a lot of pests on the same plant, they may take resources from one another. That's the problem of crowding. Males and females have to find one another. That's another game, important game. Once they've mated, they have to decide where to lay their eggs. Those are all important decisions, and insects are not making those decisions on their own. There are other insects making the same decision. They clearly impact each other's success. Those are games pests are playing with themselves. Evolutionary biology is, I'm a game theorist, forgive me, an application of game theory. Okay? Darwin had basically all the ideas already in his head. He was a great game theorist. Okay? Natural selection and sexual selection are both game theory models. There's also predators. Okay? Clearly predators are involved, and I had to learn about predators of western corn rootworm. It turns out spiders like this wolf spider are some of the more effective predators. The farmer is a very important player in games. And for one thing, the farmer makes decisions that impact the pest. Okay? Crop rotation can have a big impact on pest success. Crop cover, if it supports predators and other provides nutrients, etc. And making an effort to discover if there is a pest problem. So scouting, rescue treatments, insecticides, Bt toxins, Bt crops. So there's a bunch of decisions the farmer makes that obviously affect the pest, but there's also decisions farmers make that impact other farmers. So for these beetles, these western corn rootworms, they can fly long distances. It's very common for them to fly more than, say, 10 miles. Okay? So one farmer who doesn't take care of a pest problem, that pest problem can migrate to the other farmer. Okay? So this is a problem where farmers are clearly playing a game when it comes to the dispersal of the pest. There's also key third parties, other players who make choices that impact the options or incentives of these key players that I've laid out here. For example, a technology supplier like Monsanto can provide different types of seed. Academic scientists are crucial for our scientific understanding of these beetles. Okay, so farmers can make more informed decisions and also inform regulators and the decisions they make, okay, which can constrain farmers' options or create incentives for them. So those are all games that are important here, and when we're thinking about reversing resistance, we want to bear in mind there's lots of players who we might bring in to be part of the solution. Okay. I'm going to start, so on the question of is resistance inevitable, I'm going to start by trying to give you an understanding for why most people feel it is. Okay, because we have a long history of failure after failure after failure. Okay? So I'm going to give you a sense of that failure, but then assure you that it's not just a theory that I'm saying that resistance can be reversed. Resistance has been reversed. Okay, just not yet in your field. It's been reversed successfully in a medicine application, actually a couple medicine applications, okay, that I'm going to describe to you. And how they succeeded, given a history of repeated failures in medicine, I think could potentially be informative for how we can be successful in potentially reversing resistance when it comes to pests. Okay, so there's also a long history of underestimating the problem, okay, both in medicine and in agriculture. Here is a quote from a 1993 Monsanto petition to get the Roundup Ready gene to a non-regulated status. Okay, so they're like, hey, let us sell this Roundup Ready gene. It's highly unlikely that weed resistance to glyphosate, to Roundup, will become a problem. It's highly unlikely. But guess what? Now it's widespread. Okay, it's a widespread problem of glyphosate resistance. Roundup's not working as well anymore. And not only are we seeing it all over the place, but here in the bottom, in 2012, 61.2 million acres were affected, and the growth rate of the problem was 25% in 2011, 50% 2012. So it's a really big and spreading problem. Roundup is losing its effectiveness because of resistance of the weeds to this thing. And you can see the progression here. 1993, yeah, nothing was resistant to it yet. But, you know, not very long after, just a few years, the first grass species documented as resistant. And these are all the different species now that have documented resistance to Roundup. Okay. So that doesn't look good. And this is a different type of resistance, the western corn rootworm. And there's an example of one, ready to go, to 2 of the different types of BT toxins. Professor Meinke, who wasn't able to be here today, he's quoted here saying, it's now a regional problem. So these pests are now dispersed pretty widely. And it's not just the Western corn rootworm that's natural, our focus here. It's around the world. So in South Africa, they also use BT corn to control the African maize stalk borer, okay, a moth. And resistance to the BT maize is now widespread in South Africa. Okay? And it's not just the Western corn rootworm and African maize stalk borer. It's spreading to all sorts of major pests. So here's a quote. Insect resistance to BT crops lessens from the first billion acres. Okay, so field-evolved resistance has been reported now for 5 of the 13 major pests, compared to just 1 in 2005. Okay, so it looks like it's just a matter of time before none of them work anymore. And this problem isn't yours alone. The same thing happened in medicine. So we began discovering these antibiotics. So for example, in the 19th century, tuberculosis was an absolute scourge. Killed 25% of all deaths in Europe were that one disease. It's hard to imagine. Okay, so finally we discovered some drugs that seemed like a miracle. But in every case, just a few years later, resistance was documented, and before long became widespread. We began relying on multi-drug cocktails. Okay? But even those cocktails began working less and less effectively. Finally, in 2012, the first so-called totally resistant strains of TB were reported in India. Okay, so, and it's not just a tuberculosis story. Similar concerns of total resistance you may have heard in the news related to diseases like gonorrhea, E. coli. I'm going to talk about that one later. Staph, I'm going to talk about that one later. Okay, so it doesn't look good. Now, and there's an example. This drug called isoniazid. And this just shows. This is a quote from a news story. As they discovered this drug to treat tuberculosis widespread in the United States at the time, they thought it was a wonder drug. And 6 months later, TB patients showed they had disease resistant to the drug. Okay, so the question, I think a really important question to address to understand this thing, is how does resistance arise so quickly? Okay, if it was really if they had to acquire like tons of mutations, we would expect it to take a long time. But no, resistance arises almost as soon as you roll out the treatment. And the reason is because of a game. So in this case, the TB bacterium has been preyed upon, literally eaten, it turns out, by this other one called Streptomyces. For billions of years, the tuberculosis has been eaten by the other one. So they have developed defenses, and that's where the antibiotic comes from. So tuberculosis can defend itself against the strep. Did I say that backwards? I may have said it backwards. Let's see. Anyway, point is, tuberculosis has been locked in mortal combat with Streptomyces for billions of years. Okay, they've developed weapons and countermeasures and so on. And when we developed the drugs, streptomycin, for example, all we did is use the chemical streptomycin made and then tweaked it. So it's not a surprise that when we started exposing tuberculosis to streptomycin, TB just sort of remembered its defense. It had its defense. It's like a shield it just had laying at its side. All it had to do was lift it up. It didn't have to invent the shield. It was already there. Okay, so that's why resistance comes so fast. And the same thing with with the BT stuff. Let's flip those words around. The BT toxin. Okay, so BT toxin is based on, there's an actual microbe that makes these chemicals. And the microbe has been preying on Western corn rootworm. Okay? The microbe's been the predator for hundreds of millions of years. Okay, so it's not a new thing. This stuff lives in the soil. So rootworm knows how to defend itself against BT toxin. Okay, and once you start exposing it to it, it remembers, oh, that's BT toxin, I'll pull my shield up. The shield is already ready-made. Resistance can evolve very quickly for that reason. Okay. So it's no surprise that resistance to biologically derived treatments rises quickly. And so it makes sense. This report, for example, from this organization called GMO Safety in Europe said it's only a matter of time before pests develop resistance to basically any active ingredient used to control it. And in the medicine world, we have an even more dramatic statement from the Director General of the World Health Organization. So just like, she has sort of the same view. Just a matter of time till no antibiotics work. What's the implication of that going to be? Some experts say we're moving back to the pre-antibiotic era. No, this will be a post-antibiotic era in which an end to modern medicine, things as common as strep throat or a child scratch knee could once again kill. So be afraid. Be very, very afraid, right? Well, I'm saying actually there's a way out of that. Okay, it's possible to reverse resistance. I'm talking about that. Before I do, though, I'll spend a little time now discussing what I view, my opinion, as sort of the unfolding failure of the crop refuge approach, which has been adopted to protect Bt toxin susceptibility. But then I'll explain the unfolding success in medicine. So the Environmental Protection Agency is tasked with protecting this technology. So they say we place a high value on these plant-incorporated protectant crops. Okay, so crops that have been engineered to produce toxins that occur naturally to kill or protect the plant, kill the pest or protect the plant. And they're very safe methods. These are not poisons. They are relatively targeted to the pests that we're talking about. Okay, so they want to make sure this technology is available long into the future. And what do they do then? They require the cornfields that have insect-protected crops, or Bt crops, have a portion of the field where you plant corn that's not protected. Okay, it's called a refuge. In this refuge, the insects go crazy and they survive. But the Bt corn portion is protected. Okay, and I'll explain why it's counterintuitive why they do that, but I'll explain why in a second. But here's some examples of what it can look like. So the light bit is the unprotected crop. The darker bits are the Bt crops. Okay? All right, so there's various options you have, and this is an example where I guess it's maybe a 20% refuge. I can't tell from the picture what it is. So there's various options you have. Now, why do they do that? Well, so here's the concept of the theory of why refuges should work. And before I just walk through that explanation, let me try my own approach. Let's imagine that we had no refuge and everything was Bt corn. There would be no pests, right? But then someday, some pest would evolve resistance. And that lone survivor, or a couple of them, would mate. And all of a sudden, there'd be a huge proliferation. These things can have hundreds of eggs. Okay, so suddenly, what we might hope is a rare event, a couple resistant bugs come out, and all of a sudden, everything's overrun. Now, if you have a portion of the field that's unprotected, there's going to constantly be a bunch of pests, but they're all going to be susceptible. Okay, so when that rare pest comes out that's resistant, it won't be able to find another resistant mate. It'll mate with one of the susceptible ones. Okay, so that's the concept, at least, as explained by this guy, Professor Tabashnik. So I sort of broke down his quote to make it clearer. So the concept behind the refuge strategy is, first of all, if there are any resistant pests, they won't mate with each other. Okay, because there's all these susceptible ones flying around, they'll mate with a susceptible one. Secondly, the babies of those cross matches, so when a resistant one mates with a susceptible one, the heterozygous descendants, these progeny that are mixed, they will also die on the Bt toxin. So if those two things are true, then we will delay the rise of resistance. Okay, just to say that, I guess it's kind of counterintuitive. Let me just say that again one more time, a different way. Here are the assumptions you need to make for a refuge to work. Okay? First of all, there needs to be what I'll call random mating. Okay, when there's a bunch of pests come out and start flying around, who they choose to mate with, suppose it's random. If that's true, those two resistant pests will be very unlikely to mate with each other. Okay, so that's good news. Second, we need the Bt toxin itself to be a high enough dose that it will kill the descendants of those resistant susceptible pairs, known as heterozygous. So when they have one resistant, one susceptible parent, we need the plant toxin to kill those guys equally as well as it kills the susceptible ones. Okay? Those are the two essential assumptions. Without either of those assumptions, the whole house of cards falls down. A third property, which is nice to have, but which is not absolutely essential, is what's known as a fitness cost. So if it's true that becoming resistant causes you to become less successful in other parts of your life, okay, then you'll be at a disadvantage relative to the susceptible ones. That helps further. Okay, and I'm going to walk through this a little bit, and then I'm going to argue that the assumptions don't hold. Okay, so here's yet another way to tell the story. So I'm trying to say the same thing many ways, which is kind of a gene selection story. Okay, so we have a resistant gene. If a pest has two of those genes, then they're going to be full-blown resistant. This would be my simple conceptualization. If they have one resistant gene and one susceptible gene, they're going to be the so-called heterozygous. Okay, so the purple. If they have two susceptible, they're going to be light blue. Okay, and if you are resistant and the crop is Bt corn, you're going to have an advantage in life. You're going to grow I'm going to assume you double in size relative to the susceptible ones, so just for concreteness. All right, so now, of course, this is a simplification. We actually don't really understand the genetics of Bt resistance. There are probably multiple genes involved in complicated ways, but the exact same type of logic would apply to the more complex case, at least conceptually. First of all, let's think about the random mating assumption. Now remember, we have two, and that's just to be clear what this picture is. Imagine two resistant pests just pop out of the corn. And then we have a huge reservoir of susceptible pests. I'm only showing 4 of them. Imagine there's like thousands of them, hundreds, thousands. What if those two resistant pests just found each other? What if they could find each other and they mated? So random mating failed. If resistant pests were very likely to actually find each other, then they would double in population. And then those 4 would double. And you would get exponential growth. Actually, be more than double. It would be, maybe 50 times or 20, 30 times every generation. So you would get exponential growth. Okay, and eventually, the red ones are going to overwhelm the blue ones. And we've lost the battle. So random mating is essential. We can't have the resistant ones meeting each other with high probability. All right. Whereas, by contrast, if the red ones are almost certain to meet with blue ones, the resistant gene will essentially be buried in a purple population for a long time. So that's the idea. Okay? Now, and if there is a fitness cost as well, then while the R gene is buried in the purple heterozygote population, we can actually expect it to dwindle in number. So this is why, if there's a fitness cost, it makes life even better. Okay, because the total number of resistant genes may actually shrink over time. Okay, so that's sort of the story for the 3 assumptions. Now, it's also essential, the high dose assumption. So let's assume random mating is true. So the red, the R genes get buried in the purple population. Okay. But suppose that the heterozygotes, these purple guys, are somewhat better than the susceptible blue at surviving. Okay, they're not as good as the red ones, but they're better than the light blue. In that case, they will grow at some exponential rate. Okay, and so eventually these purple ones will grow, and they will grow large enough in number that eventually purples start mating with each other. And once purples are mating with each other, reds will emerge. And then the reds will emerge in large numbers, and then we're all toast. Okay, so that's the reason why high dose is absolutely essential. You need to kill those purple guys equally as well as you kill the blue guys for this thing to work at all. All right? Now let me do some critical thinking about these assumptions. The random mating assumption. Remember, that means that resistant pests are highly unlikely to meet each other and mate. Now, that assumption could fail for at least 3 reasons. Okay, first of all, the resistant pests and the susceptible ones might be separated in space. So it might be easier for the resistants to find each other. They could also be separated in time, and I think that's a real concern. I'll talk about it in a second. And conceivably, although this is doubtful, given what I've read, they could have within-type preferential mating. So they might like smell each other out and mate only with each other. Okay, so that seems doubtful, but it's conceivable. All right, now I'm going to give you some examples of failures or potential failures in different species. So the African maystock borer, what happens? Well, the way it works is the moths emerge, and shortly after emerging, they mate. Okay? And so you have these large fields planted with BT corn, moths emerging. They're looking to smell each other out. So it's easy to imagine that moths in the same field might be more likely to smell each other, okay, rather than smelling someone a field away. Okay? So given the role of smell and the speed of mating, it seems at least plausible that the random mating assumption might not be wrong, but sort of dramatically wrong. It could be that pests emerging from the same field could be highly likely to mate with each other. Okay? So it all depends on the way these pests move around. Okay, so it's going to depend crucially on how they move around looking for a mate. And when it comes to western corn rootworm, so here's a paper by David Oswald, and he mentions, so what they did is they took pests that they knew were resistant and pests they knew were susceptible, placed them on the BT corn and then on the regular corn, okay, and they measured when these pests came out. And it turns out they learned several interesting things. So one of the things was the resistant ones, the larvae developed faster, and the pest emerged 2 to 3 days earlier. So the resistant pests were coming out 2 to 3 days earlier. It's all on average, of course, but 2 to 3 days earlier than the susceptible ones. And what are they doing there in those 2 to 3 days? Let me give you a hint. They're mating. Okay, so if the resistant ones all come out first, they're separated in time, and we should therefore suspect the random mating assumption could dramatically fail. All right, and there's also additional factors. So one point that's also been made is when populations of not necessarily resistant pests emerge from BT corn, they tend to actually emerge later. So susceptible pests that survive will tend to grow slower, and they may have some partial resistance, and they'll emerge later. Now, those pests may also be more likely to mate with each other, because the ones that emerge earlier, they mate real fast, and as they put it here, there's limited male mating capacity. So it's hard to do multiple, there's limits on the multiple matings that a male can do. Okay, so for all those reasons, there's reasons to doubt the random mating assumption, which I've argued is absolutely essential to the theory of crop refuges. There's also the high dose assumption. And as best as I can tell, it's been a highly influential paper. I mean, I'm just surveying the literature, but showing a situation where it did work. So early on, 1992, okay, so even before Monsanto wrote that letter to the Department of Agriculture, Professor Tabashnik went out and looked at diamondback moths. And he documented that what appears to be a strong case for the high dose assumption in this particular pest. So just to point out what this graph is showing, on the x-axis is the concentration of the toxin. On the y-axis is how many of them died. And look on the right-hand side of the y-axis. That's the probability they died. Okay, so you'll notice that when the concentration is about 100, almost none of the resistant ones are dying. But basically all of the susceptible ones are dying, and almost all of the heterozygotes are dying. Okay, so these purple guys are dying, as well as the light blue ones. Okay, so that appears to fit the desired assumption. On the other hand, against western corn rootworm, it just doesn't work. And we know it. None of the currently commercialized BT toxins targeting western corn rootworm achieve a high dose. Okay, and the technical meaning of that word, of killing 99.99% of susceptible types. Okay, so none of them actually, and we know none of them achieved the high dose assumption. And it's not even close to killing 99% of them. I should say that. I don't know exactly how many susceptible died from it. I don't remember that. But anyway, so it's clear that the high dose assumption does not hold. And it's not just the western corn rootworm, African maize-stalk borer. The studies there, so just to quote a paper, results show resistance of that pest to BT corn is so-called dominant, so the opposite of what is assumed in the high-dose assumption. And so rendering futile the standard refuge strategy. And here's the table illustrating what they mean by that. So you have the SS, the RR, and the RS, just like I was explaining. And some were exposed to non-BT corn, but let's focus on the ones that were exposed to BT corn. And I've circled the two most relevant treatments. Okay? Now, but first look at the top one, SS. When they were exposed to BT corn, look at survival rate, 0.000. Yes, high dose. Okay, against the susceptible. But the high dose assumption for refuge strategy to work is not just that it kills susceptible, it's got to also kill the heterozygous ones. That's the critical part, right? And when we look at the R/S, survival rate was 38%. And for the resistant one, it was actually 25%. The numbers are 60, 195, so I mean, maybe statistics that says something there, but it seemed big enough to be meaningful. So RS are very successful on the BT corn. Okay, so the high dose assumption fails kind of in dramatic fashion if this is a true table. Right. So that could explain why resistance has grown so fast in African maize-stalk borer. Okay. And when it comes to the western corn rootworm, this is, again, the same paper by Oswald et al., though they were looking at these two lines, resistant and susceptible, and they noted no fitness costs associated with BT resistance. So acquiring the armor, if you will, of BT resistance, you would normally think, like, if you're a knight, you put on armor, it's harder to move around. So that sort of corresponds to the fitness cost. There's other things in life that are harder for you to do. No, this armor doesn't bring any costs. Not only that, it appears that resistant lines just did better. They had more eggs, even on the, when they were put on the BT maize, they had more eggs than when they were put on the regular corn. And when they were put on the regular corn, they had the same number of eggs as the regular type of pest. So they have they're supercharged. It's not just there's no fitness costs, there's the opposite of that. Okay. All right. So again, I invite real experts to, I have an attitude, my job is to be kind of provocative and throw things out there. In the process, I'm walking on a lot of thin ice. So I recognize some things I say may not be right. Feel free to interrupt me. But anyway, so this is where I'm coming from. So to recap, I argue all of the refuge assumptions fail, okay, and some of them in dramatic fashion. Given that all of the assumptions are failing for western corn rootworm, what do you expect is going to happen when we all adopt refuge strategy? Okay, what's going to happen is that resistance is going to evolve, and it's happening now. Here's a quote from the reporter Emily Unglesby, in the Progressive Farmer. She wrote recently, since the first documented case of BT-resistant western corn rootworm in 2009 in Iowa confirmed expected cases throughout the Corn Belt. Okay, so this problem is spreading. And here's a study, also from 2014, that was looking at resistance. And to understand what it's saying, let's just first look at the one on the right. Okay, so this is a BT product that still works. Okay, so what they did is they took a control population that had not been evolving in the field, and then they took some field populations. Okay, and then if there's no BT corn, if it's regular corn, they do about the same. And if it's BT corn, they both do a lot worse. So the BT corn is working here, although you'll notice both of the survival rates are 3 to 5%. So we're nowhere close to our 99.99% success rate, even on susceptible ones. But anyway, that's working, okay? Both are lower, and they're both about the same on both. Now look at this one. When BT corn, when BT is absent, they're both doing about well. But then what if we do this one called MCry3A? You'll notice that the control populations, the ones that have been kept pure the way they used to be, those get suppressed, but the field-evolved ones survive. Okay? And similarly, this cry3, capital B, little, lowercase b1. Right? So that one also isn't working anymore against the group of pests that they tested. Okay, so this is what I mean when I say they've documented resistance. All right. Now, an interesting development is that the technology companies, like Monsanto, have introduced these so-called pyramided traits. So basically the equivalent of a multi-drug cocktail to treat tuberculosis. They've said, hey, streptomycin and isoniazid aren't working. Let's just throw 5 things in the... That's what they do to treat TB. They give you a whole cocktail of drugs. And now that's where we're moving. We're giving farmers a cocktail of BT traits. Okay? So because of that, the EPA has decided we don't need as big refuge anymore. All right, so this is, as Monsanto says on their website, the fact that we're throwing all these BT genes in your direction has enabled the EPA to reduce the size of the refuge from 20% to 5%. Okay, the idea is you don't need as much protection if resistance will arise less frequently. The thing I would note is, what's the whole point of the refuge? Is to have a bunch of beetles flying around when the first resistant ones come out. That's the point. It doesn't matter how likely the beetles are to come out. It's a protection policy for when they do. Okay, so when you lower the 20% to 5%, what that's really telling me is the EPA is resigned to this thing not working at some point, and they're making a trade-off of the present and the future. How much do we give up now to change the problem, to link, the point is that the fact that resistance is less likely to pop up doesn't change the logic that I've talked through of why eventually it will fail. Okay, as long as the random mating assumption isn't correct, or the high dose assumption isn't correct, as long as there isn't a big fitness cost of resistance, there's no reason to suspect it will fail. It's just a matter of time. Okay, so this calibration of 20 to 5% is okay. So, but let me just say a few words about that. And this, I'm definitely on some thin ice here. I think I misquoted. I said Oswald was a David. He's not. I think the Onstad is the David. And so there's a recent paper out that is trying to address the question of what's the best refuge size. And this paper explicitly bears in mind that the resistance may appear at any time, and it's trading off the future and the present. So it's saying, like, okay, if we give up 5 versus 10% now, we're losing money now, but we might somewhat delay resistance in the future. What's the optimal trade-off? And so what they found is they simulated this process of dispersal of these pests, given different policies, and they looked at a 15-year horizon, and they found things like this. For pyramided corn, you're better off planting a block refuge in the same location every year rather than rotating the location of the refuge. So most farmers rotate the refuge, and they're saying, hey, you know what, you'd be better off collectively if you always planted it in the same place. And if you relocate your block refuge annually, like most farmers do, 5% refuge actually will maximize the farmer's overall profits. Okay, so that there is an argument for 5% there. But if we use single trait corn, 10 to 20% seems better than 5% or 50%. Okay, so it's basically providing a foundation for the EPA's regulation. However, I would just emphasize that this assumes all farmers follow the recommended policy. Okay, and this is an important game farmers are playing is, do they comply? So this was saying, if all farmers rotate their block refuge, they'd all be better off than if none of them rotated. If all of them used the 5% or 10% refuge, it'd all be better than if they didn't use a refuge. But individual farmers may not comply. Okay, so this is a great example where knowing the solution is not the end of the story. We have to think about how to implement the solution. Because farmers will have an incentive to choose what's best for them individually, as opposed to what's best for them collectively. Okay? And inadequate refuge protection may actually be a dominant strategy in game theory lingo for each farmer. And this is an example, a classic example, what's known as the tragedy of the commons. So one of the most famous games. So I'm going to try to, this game will pop up throughout the talk. And it's hard for me to see the clock. Is it 4:20 now? Yeah. Okay. So the story of the tragedy of the commons, let me pause since this is going to be a recurring theme. There's lots of tragedies of the commons going on here. The original story is that there's a village and there's a field where the sheep get to graze, and every shepherd gets to decide how many sheep to take up there. Each one has an incentive to let their sheep graze as much as possible. Okay? But when everyone does that, the soil's degraded, the field is gone, and everyone starves. Okay, so this is sort of the classic tragedy comes. Now, why do they do this? Because each individually is better off. The best outcome for you of all would be to overgraze your own sheep and then have everyone else hold back. That's that red 4. The worst outcome for you would be for everyone else to overgraze, the pasture gets shot anyway, but you're not taking advantage of it. So you individually always have an incentive to graze more than is good for the village. But when everyone does that, everyone suffers. Okay? If only we could find a way out, we could get to this outcome. Where we all use the pasture responsibly, and we all get a better outcome. And when I emailed, well, he's Dr. Onstad, not a professor anymore, I guess. When I emailed Dr. Onstad, yeah, he confirmed this, because in his model, I asked him if his model accounted for individual farmer incentives, and he pointed out that no, one farmer could do better for themselves by not planting, for example, BT corn. If everyone around you is planting BT corn, you can actually do better if everyone else is doing a refuge, you can do better not doing a refuge. Okay, so it's not an equilibrium in game theory speak for all the farmers to follow the regulation. Okay, so, and the same comment would apply to all the other sort of practices, I mean, potentially to many of the other practices he mentioned on his list. Individual farmers might not have an incentive to do it. So, just for example, rotating the refuge. I'm not sure. So do you move the portion of the field that has the refuge on it? That might be good for the individual farmer, or it might entail some cost to the farmer. I mean, because, let's be frank, if you leave the refuge in the same place every year, you're probably going to have more pests on your own property. Okay? So that's sort of a benefit that you're providing to your neighbors by having more pests on your own property, because you're limiting the rise of resistance on your own property. So it's natural to suspect that even that might be a prisoner's dilemma. Okay, but anyway, so I think I've given you enough bad news. We're about halfway through the talk, so let me start giving you actually more than halfway through the talk. Let me give you some good news. It is possible to reverse resistance. I'll tell you an example where it's been done and it's happening now, and then tell you the theory for why it works. And thank goodness, because these nightmare bacteria are really scary. I don't know if you've heard about these things. They're called CRE. It stands for carbapenem-resistant enterobacteriaceae. Okay, so there's this class of drugs from carbapenem, which are basically the drugs of last resort. So if nothing else works, they give you carbapenem. If your disease is resistant to carbapenem, you die half the time in the hospital. Okay, so there's extremely deadly, extremely scary things. Not only that, because bacteria swap genes, completely unrelated bacteria can get the same genes and become completely resistant as well. Okay, so if these things spread, it could be a genuine nightmare. And they have spread. The first one, I'm from North Carolina, so that's a dubious distinction. The first hospital in the United States where we documented carbapenem CRE was North Carolina. Now it's everywhere except, I guess, Idaho, Alaska, and a couple other states. Okay, so you have it here in Nebraska. You have had it. Okay, so it's extremely scary. And moreover, it's impossible to completely contain. It's just literally impossible to contain because the tests that can detect CRE sometimes fail. Okay, so you can't possibly catch it all. Okay, so it would seem to be impossible to stop. And yet, we're winning. Israel had a national outbreak that they successfully combated using a new strategy. And CRE elimination has been confirmed. Eradication has been confirmed in numerous hospital facilities. Okay, and this disease spreads inside hospitals. So each of those hospital eradications is a success story. Okay, so you can see how recent this stuff is. So they're using this new approach, which the CDC has embraced. The CDC has branded it Detect and Protect, and I'll tell you what it is in a second. And not only has it worked, but is predicted by theory to work. Okay, and I'm a theorist, so that means a lot to me. I not only know that it does work, I know why it works. Okay, and why is it that it works? It's because we're changing a fundamental feature here of many treatments, which is what I call equal treatment. So imagine we have two types of bacteria, and these guys I think are salmonellas, if I remember. So some of them are resistant to the drug treatment, others are susceptible. If we give the same treatment to both of them, lo and behold, who's going to thrive? The resistant one. Okay, so they go from being equal in the population to resistant being, say, double in the population. Now, to break that, we need to give different treatments. Okay, so if we can identify who has a resistant strain, we could give them a different treatment. And for illustration purposes, I'm using isolation. You put them in a room, that's vacuum sealed. Right? Isolation stops all further transmission. So they're more dead than the susceptible ones. Okay, so if you can tailor more intensive treatment to the resistant ones, then you can actually reverse the prevalence of resistance. They go from being equal to being none. Okay? And you don't have to identify all of them. As long as you identify enough of them, it can work. Okay, so the key to this thing is doing your best to monitor cases, to identify cases in your hospital. You give more intensive treatment to people who have CRE. In this case, it's such a scary disease that they isolate them. That's the more intensive treatment. But then, more importantly, you then go out and hunt for more. So if you try to figure out how a person got the disease, and maybe they got it from a machine, you go and test every single person who also touched that machine. Okay, you do an epidemiological search. The same sort of thing they're doing nowadays for these Ebola cases. Try to find all the people who were in touch with them. Okay, and test them. Okay, and this can work. So here we have an example where the resistant strain naturally grows faster. So it grows by a factor of 3 instead of 2. But when we do detect and protect, we wind up shrinking the resistant disease as an overall fraction of the population. And it works in two ways that work together. So the first is you may just discover someone has it, and you isolate it. Okay? So that first black X. Once you've figured that out, you say, hey, were they using a shared machine? Were they in a shared room? And that allows you to trace another person who caught the disease, and then you stop it in its tracks there. Okay, so overall, so you stopped what would have been a second round of transmission. Right. So the susceptible strain is at an advantage overall relative to the resistant strain because you're able to target treatment. That's the idea. Now, how we translate this to pests is not obvious, and that's something I'll try to talk about at the end. But to do that, I want to first sort of lay out the real simple theory of pest control, right, which also applies to microbe control and resistance. And first starting with what I call the games of life. It's a little cutesy, but this is, the idea here is to think about all the stages that say, I'm going to start with microbes, and I'll do pests. The key stages a microbe goes through in life. If you can disrupt its success in any one of those stages, you can potentially disadvantage it relative to the resistant strain. So first of all, infection. Okay? there's lots of things we do to try to put microbes, diseases, at a disadvantage in the infection stage. For example, just being healthy, sleeping, running, like those things actually make microbes less successful. Vaccines would be the other obvious one. Okay, you have a vaccine that prepares your body to fight off infection. Transmission, okay, before you seek medical attention. Okay, so before you know you're sick, you wash your hands. Okay, that's one thing. Or someone else discovers you might have had it through the so-called contact tracing. Okay, so that's another way you could be discovered before you seek out medical attention. Someone could tell you, hey, you're at risk. You eat at a restaurant where everyone got, a stomach illness. Beware. Okay, and there's also transmission after the host, we're the host, seek medical attention. So antibiotics would be an example, or quarantine, for example. Now, in the life of a pest, there's a similar progression, okay? And so when you're a western corn rootworm, you come out of your egg and you got to find a root, okay? So host finding. And in the case of western corn rootworm, crop rotation is really effective because they can only move like a foot or two. They wiggle out and then they can't go very far. So, and they need certain types of plants. So if you have corn and they lay the egg there and then you rotate it to soybean, it's a death sentence, okay, basically, for these guys at the larval stage. So crop rotation is an example of a treatment that disrupts success at the host finding stage. Then there's the larval growth stage. So you could have predators that you foster there. You could use insecticides, BT corn, things that kill the pest when it would have found something to eat, but you still slow its growth or kill it. And then mating. And so there's things you can do to change the game of mating. And for example, I don't know if this is really done in practice much, but staggered planting, if it were feasible, might be a strategy because corn that's planted earlier, the pest will emerge earlier and mate with itself, the ones that emerge earlier. So the timing of emergence from the crop could be influenced by choices we make. And in the case of dispersal and egg laying, there's for example, this thing called trap crop, where you plant something that confuses the pest, that lands in the wrong place and lays its eggs there. Okay, so there's strategies that can address all the different stages of life. Now, the fundamental challenge, what seems to be a conflict, is that if we try to reduce the burden of a pest or the burden of a disease, so we try to have as few people sick as possible or have the least crops damaged as possible, it may tend to lead us to have more resistant pests, more resistance disease. I'm going to argue that's actually not true, but let me just first lay out what appears to be the conflict. And you've all probably heard the legend or myth, I guess myth, because it didn't exist, right, of Sisyphus, who's condemned to always push the rock up the hill and then it rolls down right when he's about to get to the top. Well, let me argue that's what's going on in pest management as well. Okay? So every new treatment option that comes out, farmers get to adopt it and they sort of get the ball rolling in terms of controlling the pest population. But ultimately, the ones that are resistant are going to be those that survive, right? The more resistant ones will survive, they'll thrive, and then the ball comes rolling back down the hill, okay? And not only do you have to start over just where you were before, but you have fewer treatment options than before. So just like Dr. Chan of the WHO said, no, it's not pre-antibiotic world, it's post-antibiotic world. Here it's like, no, it's not pre-BT, it's post-BT. They just won't work anymore. And there's no hope of them working anymore once the ball is rolled down the hill. So unfortunately, we don't get to do it infinitely many times. So Sisyphus actually had it better than us. Okay. So this is another example where understanding the problem isn't enough. Because again, farmers have, if you know for a fact that this BT trait is only going to work for 10, 15, 20 years, you have an incentive to use it as much as you can yourself before the party's over, right? So we need everyone to change their behavior. No individual can solve the problem. So this is another tragedy of the commons. And so the point here is that if others are, using say an insecticide in a really broad way that's more likely to lead to resistance, you have an incentive to do the same because you'll be at a disadvantage otherwise. Resistance is going to arise anyway. You have a dominant strategy to overuse, misuse these technologies. Okay. And we can't blame the farmer. I mean, it's in their own individual incentive to do so. So this is another example of the tragedy of the commons, where in the place of overgrazing, we put overly broad use of the pest control treatment. Okay. Now, this is a repeat of the previous slide with the logic, the Sisyphean logic, that the ball is always going to eventually get away from us. But the logic is wrong. Okay, this is the key idea. There's a kind of hidden assumption in this logic that if Sisyphus just could recognize it, then he could, we could avoid the problem. It assumes uniform treatment, equal treatment. It assumes the resistant pests are exposed to the same treatment as the susceptible ones. So just like in medicine, the key was to figure out how to treat the resistant ones differently. Isolation was the example there. If we can figure out different ways to identify resistant pests and treat them differently, that could help solve the problem. Again, I'll try to address some of the practical issues in a second. But let me just first give you the theory. So the answer is what I call diagnosis and targeted treatment. So this is the general approach to reversing resistance to treatment. So here's the idea. Normally we think of, okay, there's treatment, there's another treatment, there's another treatment, there's another treatment. Every year you treat them. Okay? And you always treat them the same way. That's the uniform or equal treatment. But in fact, there's the potential for diagnosis. Okay? And that diagnosis of resistance can come in 2 points. And what you do, the strategic options you have, will depend on whether we can do pre-treatment diagnosis or post-treatment diagnosis. Okay? So, for example, let's look at the pre-treatment case. Imagine if the farmer could somehow know ahead of time that their crop is at risk of resistant pest. If they could somehow know that, then an effective alternative treatment could be prescribed. Okay, they would have an incentive to do things that stop the resistance from spreading on their fields. Okay, that's the first thing. Now, that might not be possible, but still, after the resistant pests arrive, the farmer can notice damage on the crops. And now, post-treatment diagnosis, and can prescribe a different follow-up treatment. Okay, you can change what you do depending on what you see. Okay, so that's the idea. And as long as that follow-up treatment is more intensive, and in the end, so the resistant pest may have an advantage in this initial treatment, but then will suffer your wrath, basically, in the second follow-up treatment. As long as the net effect of those two things is negative, you can actually reverse resistance, even when you can't do pre-treatment diagnosis. Okay, so that's basically the simple theory. Now we just need to think, well, what in the world would it mean to pre-treatment diagnosis? What in the world would follow-up treatments look like? Like, that's what we really need to think about. The theory is clear. It's just the application that's a question. Okay, so again, what we want is for the resistant strain to be at an overall reproductive disadvantage. And that's possible if we can do pre-diagnosis and give alternative treatment, or if we can do post-diagnosis and have very intensive follow-up treatments. So either of those two, if they're possible. All right, and so now I'm going to go over 3 examples, and I'll just skim through the methicillin resistance one, but I do that one because I want to illustrate what a diagnostic game changer would look like. And then I'll talk about the other 2 Western corner. So methicillin resistance, another nasty disease. A book called Superbug was written about it. The author of that book, the subtitle, if you can't read it, Medicine Disregarded, Antibiotics Can't Control It. This methicillin resistant staph is the most frightening epidemic since AIDS. Okay, so now let's just quickly look at this using this diagnosis and treatment framework. First of all, pre-treatment diagnosis, very difficult. it takes 2 to 3 days to develop the culture. So it's very hard to tell if a person is resistant to the disease. Okay, and alternative treatments are not particularly attractive. So you wouldn't want to give them to everybody as a precaution. Okay, so there's what's the word? Complications? No, whatever. The other medicines have their problems. However, it is possible to, once you notice the medicine's not working, to change your treatment approach, but that may be too little too late because there's a window of time when the disease is now spread before you've treated it. So we really need to figure out a way to do pre-treatment diagnosis. And the good news is that in the 2000s, so after this problem was already prevalent, a new technology was invented. The underlying technology, polymerase chain reaction, existed for a long time. But the first people finally figured out how to do it. Okay, and they created these little tests, these little cartridges. You can run a test, and instead of taking 2 to 3 days, in a couple hours, it can tell you if your patient is resistant to methicillin. Okay, and it's completely transformed treatment of the diseases that they've developed the diagnostics for. And so this is the machine. A box like this is probably in a hospital near you. Okay, and you can fit all sorts of cartridges in it and detect all sorts of diseases. There's a flu cartridge. There's a tuberculosis cartridge. There's a whole bunch of different diseases that you can detect. Not only have the disease, and it does it by reading the genetic code. And so there are strings of the genes that are like hallmarks that only are possessed by this disease in question. And what they do is they take a biological sample and they spin it. This is my simplified version. They spin and chop it up in little pieces like a blender, and they look, and they use this technology, this PCR technology, to multiply by the millions the genes, and they look for little snippets. And if they find the snippet, they say, yes, you have it. If they don't find the snippet, we know for a fact you don't. Okay, so, and I argue in the book that this type of pre-treatment diagnosis is an absolute game changer. And, recent advances in genetic testing have created new strategic options that hold the potential to reverse antibiotic resistance, and in doing so, to tame bacterial disease forever. Okay, so I think it's a really big deal in the bacterial world. Now let's try to apply these ideas to the Western corn rootworm world with an understanding that I'm not an expert in this. I'm brainstorming and throwing out some possibilities for what, say, follow-up treatment might look like. I'm throwing out some ideas for what pre-treatment diagnostics might look like, and seeing what sticks. Okay, and but just to remember, the key thing, for example, for follow-up treatment is it has to be more damaging to the resistant pest than it is to the susceptible pest. That is the key feature of follow-up treatment that is meant to reverse resistance. So somehow we have to figure out a way to hurt resistant ones more than susceptible ones. And that's not an easy thing. So first, let's look at crop rotation as the treatment. Okay, and I think this is a really interesting one because Western corn rootworm resistance to crop rotation has evolved. So let me just back up. So the way this beetle works is it lays its eggs in the ground once a year, and then they come out the next year. Okay, and they're deposited in the soil. As I mentioned, they cannot move more than 10 to 20 inches. So, so if you change up the crop you're on, they all die. So they need to emerge in a crop that's compatible with their lifestyle, like pumpkin or corn.
Can I just interject there?
Yeah, please.
Western corn rootworm only can't survive on cucurbits.
Yeah, I meant Western corn rootworm. What?
No, they can't survive on cucurbits.
They cannot?
Not the larvae, no. The adults will feed on them.
Oh, that's good news then. That's good news. Okay, so you can now rotate your crop with pumpkins if you want to. Awesome. Okay, that's really good. I'm really glad you interjected with a supporting fact as opposed to an undermining fact. That's good. But anyway, so they've actually evolved in two documented ways. There's corn rootworms in general. So one is they stay in the ground for 2 years. And they pop out when it's corn again. Okay, that's pretty clever. And the western corn rootworm, they've evolved this lack of fidelity to corn, lack of maize fidelity, and so the females are relatively more likely to lay eggs in the soybeans. So when you rotate the soybeans into corn the next year, they pop out and survive. Okay, so that's the problem. And this rotation-resistant strain is spreading. I mean, it's not that bad in, I guess, Nebraska yet, but it's coming, okay? So if we can find a way to stop it, that'll be good. Oh, wait, it's spreading 10 to 30 kilometers a year as the little beetles fly and get pushed by the storm winds. Okay, so the challenge is, so let's just lay out the challenge. Pre-treatment diagnosis seems really tough, because that would require you to anticipate when that first beetle is going to land on your crop in some storm. How can you possibly know that? That seems infeasible. Okay, and moreover, once you detect them, because some regular rootworm also lay eggs in soybean, it's not like only the mutants do that. You're only going to notice them when there's sufficiently many of them, by which time they've dispersed to other places as well. So the sort of horse gets out of the barn before you can detect them. So just like the CRE, that nightmare bacteria, these look impossible to completely contain. However, post-treatment diagnosis is relatively straightforward in that once they've damaged your crop, you can notice that they were there. So in principle, you can have follow-up treatments. And I don't have enough time to go through all the pictures I have. You're going to see I spent like hours and hours and hours creating these little pictures. But here's a couple that I brainstormed. And again, these might not be workable. You can tell me. But, so imagine you're doing corn, soybean, corn, soybean. What if you did instead of that 2-year rotation, you could then do, say, a 3-year rotation. And the important thing is that there would be a year where you had no corn. Okay, so I will show the picture real fast. So this is when you notice that there's a problem. So the red is the corn, blue is the soybean, and green is the wheat. And I found some website that said corn, soybean, wheat makes sense. But that's the only reason I use wheat. Farmers can decide what the third thing should be. Pumpkins apparently would work. So anyway, so there's a year where there is, okay, so you notice the damage, and now what you do is you rotate corn into soybean, soybean into wheat. So you have a year where there's no corn, and now they all die. Okay, and the next year, you get a few extended diapause guys popping out, but mainly you have immigrants from other areas flying in. So you're reseeding or rebooting your population. This is the idea. So you could use this treatment to basically wipe out another thing is you could leave everything fallow. That would be another way to do it. That's a little more costly, so I didn't think that was realistic. Okay, so you do something to just wipe out all the local population, and because western corn rootworm fly so far, you actually use that to your advantage, and you have the ones you want from the outside, susceptible ones, to come in and reboot your population. So that's the basic idea. And that same rebooting idea could apply to BT corn. So imagine you never use BT corn. You're like a corn soybean farmer. But then you notice rotation isn't working for you in a year. It isn't working for you as much anymore. You switch to BT corn for 1 year. And that just basically does the same thing of wiping them out. Okay, a few will survive, but as long as those few are mostly immigrants who have laid their eggs, but they were born in another place, then, and as long as the immigrant population is not resistant to rotation, so those two assumptions have to hold, then you can reboot your population. So if there's a region where this rotation resistance is prevalent, this strategy could be very successful near the boundary of the region, because beetles would come, at least many beetles would come from a susceptible area. Okay. So those were treatment game changers for crop rotation. A similar idea could apply treatment game changers for resistance to BT crops. Okay. Now again, pre-treatment diagnosis seems equally hard because you'd have to know when that first pest arrives from some other field. So challenging to predict. And again, by the time you notice that they're there may be enough of them that they're spreading out. So that may or may not be true. So again, it might be just like that CRE disease. On the other hand, again, you can notice once the damage gets enough, and you can prescribe follow-up treatments that could be really damaging to these pests relative to what their cousins are experiencing in other fields. So like a corn-soybean rotation, let me just throw that out there. Because the year when it's all soybean, we'll kill them off. Okay, so if you're using BT corn, which is now the green, you could then, I constrain myself to do things I thought farmers might actually do. So the bottom line is the same, that some follow-up treatment that really wipes out the local population and allows the immigrants to come in and reboot. So that's the idea, the basic idea of the treatment approaches, follow-up treatments. Now what I think is even more exciting are diagnostic game changers. So let me try to get to that. To do what I said was not possible, which is to predict the arrival of resistant pests. Because we're in the midst of, so you guys are developing technologies to model the spread of the beetles. Okay? So here's a paper from 1999 that was modeling the spread of the rotation-resistant strain from where it started out. Okay? And you would use weather information, understanding of when the pests come out to predict where they were likely to land. Okay? And that analysis was focused on the frontier of that pest subpopulation. So it was modeling how far the envelope was being pushed. But you could modify that approach, I think, to model not just the pioneer movement, but actually model the broader movements of these pests across all regions. So if one particular farmer noted that resistant pests were growing on his farm, he could alert the service. They would combine it with weather information and tell another farmer, hey, a guy 10 miles down the road has resistant pests. Here's your predicted outcome. You have a 25% chance of resistant infestation. That seems feasible. Okay? If farmers experiencing infestations report it, a central authority could use the best available science to predict where more careful scouting and preemptive measures could be appropriate. Okay? And right, so that's how we could potentially change the game in terms of pre-treatment diagnostics. Okay, now let me wrap up and for a few more minutes and then open it up to questions and feedback. Okay? So, yes, this could potentially work, but it requires the farmers to play along. Okay, so this is an important thing. Farmers have to be willing to report when they have an infestation, and they have to be willing to act on let's say 25% information or whatever in a way that helps stop the spread of resistance. Unfortunately, I think there's reason to suspect, to be concerned, that there's another tragedy that comments here, that just informing farmers of their individual risk may not be enough to induce them to take the actions that benefit everyone. Because that first year or that first couple of years of infestation, they may not suffer very large economic damages. So it may be in their own individual interest to wait until the infestation actually could be a problem for their neighbors before they act. Okay, so if that's true, then we're stuck in another tragedy that comments. Okay, so good news is, the game theory, in the book I go through all the possible solutions to the tragedy that comments, offers several different types of approaches for solving these so that they don't become tragedies. Okay, for example, you could have a legal requirement. So in the case of fishing, there are catch limits. Okay? I personally doubt that would work well. Farmers are a species of their own that are probably highly resistant to the legal requirements. But there's also local collective governments. Okay? So in the case of water management, there are these natural resource districts that facilitate cooperation. This is really interesting, I think, but I don't know farmers that well, but I'm guessing it's probably not particularly realistic, but it's probably worth exploring and thinking about. And then lastly, there's incentives, okay? And there's carrots and sticks, but let's just think about carrots here. Like bottle deposits for recycling. That's another example of a solution to a tragedy that comments. And this seems to me potentially the most promising, and in order to provide incentives, though, you need some party to pay up, right? So it seems to me like a couple of the promising ones might be crop insurance subsidies, which are already conditioned on how farmers plant their crops, and potentially stewardship agreements that all farmers who have BT crops have to have these stewardship agreements specifying what they're going to do. Those could also be tied potentially to financial incentives, although they're not really right now. And I would just note that insurance subsidies already influence crop selection. So in this paper by Michael Gray, he noted that the USDA has this thing called federal crop insurance, okay? And they approved reductions in premiums for those who bought the BT seed. Okay, so that was great for Monsanto. Okay, so now farmers have an incentive to buy the BT seed that's unrelated to how much corn it's going to grow, that they pay less in insurance. Okay, but so the concept is already there. Shouldn't we instead tie those crop insurance subsidies to actual activities that reduce the risk of insurance? You know, it's like your home insurance premium goes down when you put in a smoke detector, right? That makes sense because it's reducing the likelihood of damage. Okay? But instead, we're incentivizing people to plant corn. Like, BT corn, I will reduce your home insurance if you light more fires. That makes no sense, right? Okay, so we should be encouraging them to do things that are putting out fires. Okay, it just makes sense to me. I don't know about you. But anyway, so 19% of farmers, which is a lot, indicated that this incentive had influenced their decision, in addition, of course, to other things. Okay, there's many more issues as I have I could go into, but we also, of course, need to think about the incentives of that third party. Okay, will Monsanto want to do this, etc. Okay, and I want to summarize with some provocative, in a provocative way. So let me just try to summarize. What were the main points of this talk? Okay. In addition to the game theory can be applied to the problem. Okay. So is resistance inevitable? No, it's not. We can, at least potentially, we can't stop resistance from evolving, but we can put out the fire every time it's lit. We can continually and permanently stamp out resistance. Okay? However, if we continue to basically adopt a universal treatment, and farming works one way, and we do it, and we're not adapting what we do to what we see, then yeah, eventually resistance will arrive to the pyramided BT, just like it did to the multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. So total resistance will come, and there will be a day when no farmer can use BT if we continue in the status quo. But there are things we can do so that we can keep this technology potentially in perpetuity. And the question is, why is BT resistance emerging and becoming more prevalent? And I've argued it's because of the flawed refuge strategy promoted by the EPA that is essentially guaranteed not to preserve this technology. Okay? And I've brainstormed some potential alternative strategies, but mainly to illustrate the framework, the so-called diagnostic and targeted treatment framework, the theory for how it works. But, you know, my ideas aren't going to be the right ones. We need the real experts. We need real farmers to come in and brainstorm solutions as well, figure out what will actually work. Okay? There's a secondary problem here, though, is that farmers do face a tragedy in the commons. They have individual incentives that don't necessarily align with the broader incentives. Farmers know this. They might be open to solutions as well that help solve that problem. All right. So now what does the future hold for BT crops? So the title of the talk, right? So what is my point about that? If this BT sort of monocropping sort of remains widespread, total resistance will eventually arise. Okay. However, what my analysis here has also suggested is that BT technology can work as a complement. It's not in opposition to traditional integrated pest management. It can be used as a complement to that, just as powerful drugs like carbapenem can be used as a complement to traditional holistic, medicine. Okay, so if we preserve the BT technology, we can use it, for example, like I argued, to help reverse rotation resistance. So when the traditional approaches start failing, we can use BT like our last resort drug. That's one way for sure we could use it. However, I think it's fair to let an opposing view have the kind of final word, if you will. And here is Doug Gurian Sherman from the Union of Concerned Scientists. So he has some serious concerns with BT technology. As he explains, in healthy agro ecosystems, there's usually limited need for these types of pest control, and usually, you can meet that need in other ways, such as breeding. Why should farmers, and also there's extra costs because it's controlled by evil corporations, is sort of the general gist. Why should they have these extra costs when cheaper technologies will work? In a sensible agricultural system, it's not clear that BT corn is really needed or worth the cost. Okay. I said he'd get the last word, but I lied. So I'm going to get the last word. No, of course you want to keep BT corn. My perspective, why throw out a treatment option? Okay, it could be useful, as I mentioned, as a drug of last resort. But the point is good, that what we really need is not just to preserve the BT technology, but I would argue we need to bring back an element of old-fashioned integrated pest management, the so-called supervised control. Now, so after World War II, there was a problem with an error. I'm walking on thin ice, because my knowledge about this is about 2 days of research thick. Okay, so I may be getting the history even wrong here. But after World War II, widespread adoption of synthetic insecticides. And there was a concern that resistance would arise to these things. So entomologists such as this guy Vernon Smith and many others proposed this concept of supervised control, which is now known by the name of integrated pest management. But I would emphasize that it's true that it integrates many things, but from my perspective as a game theorist, the most important part of it is the supervised part, that you are watching and you are changing what you do depending on what you see. Okay, when you have supervised control, there's hope that you can permanently keep resistance at bay. Okay, so that's the idea, and that's what we need. The question is, can supervised control return in time? Okay, so I wrote, I've been emailing correspondence with various entomologists. So Joe Spencer at University of Illinois, he wrote back to me. I hope he's okay with me using this, but he didn't say anything bad. It's interesting, he used the same phrase, sensible agriculture system, as that other guy did. That sensible agricultural system just doesn't exist anymore. It's possible to grow corn in a lower input way, but farmers can't do that anymore. Everyone is on kind of a treadmill, my own word now, where everyone is producing high quantities. Because of that, price is being depressed, and now everyone has to produce high quantities to keep up. Okay, so asking farmers to do more to get less just isn't going to work. Okay? And what's interesting here is, what this suggests to me, and this might be blasphemy, okay, but is that high productivity could be a tragedy of the commons. Okay, how so? Farmers have to decide, do I want to produce a lot of corn or less corn? If they produce less corn, price of corn goes up, their profits increase. They're all better off if they do the more low-intensive, low-output, sustainable approach. They're actually more profitable, but only if they all switch. Any single farmer, that would be foolish to produce less. Okay, so they have a dominant strategy to maximize their own yield, but they all suffer. Now, that's a theory. I have to look at the price elasticity to see if that's actually true. But that's the story, and if that's true, anyway, so there's lots of ways to escape this tragedy of the commons. Another name for tragedy of the commons is prisoner's dilemma. And if you're interested, the book goes through 5 distinct ways of changing the game and to solve tragedies of the commons. We'll have to see what choice do we make, or if we make no choice, that's of course also a choice. And I think this could really determine the future, not only of whether BT works, but the nature of the farming system. Will we stay on the high yield treadmill or not, get to a more sustainable place? Okay, so I think we have a few minutes for maybe questions, and I say thank you. I use that most of the time, but I'm going to stay here while you have questions. If you need to leave, feel free. Yes?
Would it be fair to say that the key to what you're suggesting here is essentially you're imposing fitness costs? So
It's an endogenous fitness cost
yeah,
by a targeted treatment.
if a population is becoming resistant, then have a higher probability of getting smacked with something else.
Exactly. So all the insights we have about fitness costs apply here. It's just that we're trying to figure out a way for mankind to impose a targeted cost on only one strain of a pest. And the trick is, how do you target treatment at one strain of a pest and not others? Key idea I had was, well, let's imagine conceptually that one field is infested and another field is not. Just decimate that field. You will target the treatment because you'll be decimating an infested field, leaving a regular field status quo. So that's sort of the basic idea. Any other questions? All right. And the neat thing about it is it uses the dispersal of the pest to our advantage. We can't get rid, like when I had that slide, that crazy sounding slide about bacterial being controlled forever, I didn't mean we won't get sick. I just meant that the resistant bacteria can be controlled forever. So you'll get sick, but there'll be a medicine. In the same way, if we can preserve BT, it doesn't mean that there won't be outbreaks of resistant BT pests. It just means that we can tamp it down and preserve it too long. Yes.
So, I'm a biochemist, not an agronomist, not a farmer. And what I'm telling you is hearsay. Maybe others can...
Heresy or hearsay?
Hearsay.
Okay.
But it's my understanding that what's happening with the BT refuge is that what's happening is that the susceptible seed is being mixed with...
Refuge in a bag.
That's correct. And so it's dispersed throughout.
That's a good point. So when you put
So
the
that's
seed...
not in agreement with the kind of strategy that you said was now in place.
Okay, good point. So let me just address that. So a new approach is coming to disperse the seeds that will solve the problem of separation in space. Okay, so I mentioned how seeds were planted in blocks and the beetles had to fly around and they might be more likely to mate with their next door neighbor. Okay, that was a problem. Now with the seed in a bag, they throw out the seed, there will always be a susceptible beetle nearby on the same plant. Okay? The problem is there's still separation in time. They're coming out 2 to 3 days earlier. So I agree. Refuge in a bag solves one aspect of the problem, and you might expect it to help address, and it might be an improvement when it comes to Western cordon rootworm in particular. Yeah?
The other thing refuge in the bag does help address is non-compliance by farmers.
Is what?
Non-compliance by farmers.
Because they simply can't buy it. They can't tell which seeds are which. They knew they wanted to, they couldn't sort it out. Yeah, that's true. Yes?
You talked about a flawed refuge. I would argue that the refuge concept wasn't necessarily flawed. It was applied for an insect that had a different biology that didn't fit.
The corn borer?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been very successful on that one. And we can understand that using the theory. Because the way that moth works is they all fly to a third location and they mate there. So they do the random mating by the very process they use to mate. Okay, so when they're born in separate physical locations, they co-locate as part of their strategy, and then they all mate together in like a grassy field or something. So the random mating assumption, very valid, and they wait, I guess. I mean, they all go to the same place at the same time. So that helps explain why the refuge strategy can be very effective against the European corn borer, but not against the Western corn rootworm. So every pest is a different game, right? So but you can use the same concepts to understand. But I gotta say, I have not heard people say that the refuge strategy only works for the corn borer and is specifically designed not to work for the Western corn rootworm. And if you go to Monsanto's website, it's very clearly not the message. So,
I guess the other thing to think about with Western corn rootworms and why EPA chose the strategy that they did for rootworms is, their interest was more in reducing the input of synthetic organic insecticides into the environment than they were about resistance. And that agency deals with weighing the risks and balance
I mean, the nice thing is that science has shown, if I understand right, that if you're using the BT, insecticide doesn't give you any extra protection. So it's actually dramatically reducing the insecticide. It's probably even good for human health or for the ecosystems, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just saying that as an outsider, as I started learning about this, everything I was reading from the EPA was, we're committed to protecting the BT as a treatment against West River for the long term, and this is how we're doing it. And as a game theorist, I'm thinking, this is designed not to work. So, I mean, that's just my provocative point. It should not work. And if you have a strategy that you know by theory, like, should not work, my instinct is, hey, let's continue the conversation and try to figure out something else. I don't hear a conversation going on in the literature about what else we should be doing. I haven't found it. We should, you guys, you experts, should be having a conversation about, well, what strategy will work, and maybe the ideas of game theory might guide you to certain alternative approaches. Yes, sir.
Another comment from a biochemist. So as I understand the power of pyramiding is that if you have independent resistances, say BT resistances, then the power of putting two together is the multiple of those. Okay, so if it's 1 in a million chance of developing BT resistance, you put two independents together and it's a trillion. Okay, you put three together and you're 10 to the 18th. Okay, which is.
I understand, but you are the expert on chemistry, but I'm sorry to report that we've already seen this movie and we know the ending. Because the exact same argument was put forth for why drug cocktails would remain effective. Now, they did remain effective, so instead of individual drugs lose their susceptibility in a single host, to like in the same person it evolves in the same person. Okay, so it's inside you and it doesn't have to transmit. Multi-drug cocktails did work for some decades. So yeah, it's better. But it didn't work for 1 million more years. So, our understanding of the genetics of this thing are sufficiently incomplete that we don't even know if they're completely independent. And they're also not random mutations. There's the story that this stuff is sitting in the arsenal, just waiting to be picked up.
So I'm certainly not saying never will be.
It should be better. It should be better.
There's a big difference in numbers that you're talking about when you're talking about.
Yeah, no, but one more piece of evidence I'll just throw out. I had that picture with the 3 different traits. And there was already a pest resistant to 2 of the 3. 2 at the same time. Okay, that pest only had 1 more to go. Are you still confident? We don't know, and are we going to risk the whole future of BT on that assumption? Or do we want to take some preventative, creative approaches to protect the technology in the hopefully likely event that it actually will evolve pretty fast? That's sort of my. Yes?
To follow on about the point about pyramiding is you only really get that advantage if resistance to all of the components of the pyramid are rare, which I would argue certainly resistance to Pro3BB1 was probably never particularly rare, and it certainly isn't now. So
yeah, and the bacteria is in the soil everywhere. So it's very natural for this to be something that they have almost readily available to them.
Yeah, I would buy that argument for BTs, but for conventional insecticides where there's really no natural analog, that I'm not quite sure how that theory holds, yet we know resistance evolves just as quickly for synthetic chemicals.
I mean, I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that a lot of antibiotics are also synthetically derived, but they're derived from, they're inspired by biological mechanisms. And then they're tweaked in order to make them more effective. But ultimately, the channels of effectiveness are similar to those that the pest has already developed resistance to in the past. So I think that we have, so what's really exciting would be to come up with a completely different approach. And actually, the world of medicine, they've actually invented one in the last couple of years, which I'll talk about some other tools. But a completely different approach. And so, but we're not there yet. We're talking about our biologically inspired
myths that maybe you've heard of already, that some of those areas in Illinois that have had the rotation resistance, they've actually recently seen populations that seem to have both the rotation resistance and the BT resistance. So BT corn planted after soybeans.
Yeah, no, we should expect that, right? Total resistance is coming. It's just, you gotta push back. Right?
Maybe time for one more question?
Maybe you're saying, like, you're free to go.
One more question?
Yeah.
I guess mine's kind of a comment, but a lot of the things that you suggested seem to already exist in terms of monitoring for sentinel plots, you know, these are, or disease forecasting. So I'm not an entomologist.
Yeah, so I'm trying to propose things that are close to what could be realistic.
But I think the thing that you really hit on that hit something in me was incentivizing this, and the fact that for farming situations, that's very prevalent.
Yeah, I would think there'd be a great value to having sentinel farmers who are willing to do certain activities that help the rest of us, and they get some benefit from that. Or they could partner with, scientists like you who could, provide kits to them, or who could go out in the field yourself.
That kind of thing already exists, though.
Okay, well then we should just do it. We should just do it.
The tragedy of the commons, I think, is a really key point. It's very important.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, David. This was an
And
excellent
I can sign any books too.
Please continue the conversation.
Yeah, I'll be right outside.
Books stand, Nebraska Books Club, over coffee.